My name is Delphine Hargrove, and I'm 68 years old. I've lived through wars, losses, and heartbreaks that would break most people. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what I discovered that cold October night at our family cabin in the Montana wilderness. The cabin had been in our family for 3 generations. My late husband, Richard, built the extension with his own hands 40 years ago. After he passed 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, this place became my sanctuary. The towering pines, the crystal-clear lake, the absolute silence broken only by the occasional call of a loon. It was where I came to remember him, to feel close to him again. That weekend, my son Darian and his wife Lucinda had asked if they could use the cabin. They said they needed time away from the city, away from stress. Darian was 42, a successful corporate lawyer in Seattle, with the kind of driven personality that left little room for softness. Lucinda, 38, was a real estate developer, sharp as a knife and twice as cold. I'd never warmed to her in the 8 years they'd been married, but I kept my opinions to myself. A mother learns when to speak and when to stay silent. I'd told them I wouldn't be there, that they'd have the place to themselves. But at the last minute, something pulled me back. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was just the restlessness that had plagued me since Richard died. I drove up Friday evening, arriving after dark, and parked my old Subaru behind the woodshed where it couldn't be seen from the main cabin. I used my spare key to enter through the back door, quiet as a ghost. The cabin was dark except for a dim light upstairs. I could hear them talking in low voices in the master bedroom. Not wanting to startle them or create an awkward situation, I decided to sleep in the small guest room downstairs and surprise them with breakfast in the morning. I was exhausted from the 3-hour drive on winding mountain roads, and sleep came quickly. Then, at 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of voices outside. The temperature had dropped significantly. Through the thin curtains of my window, I could see my breath forming small clouds in the moonlight that streamed through the glass. The voices were urgent, hushed but strained with effort. I recognized them immediately. Darian and Lucinda. My heart began to pound. Nothing good happens at 3 a.m. I moved carefully to the window, staying in the shadows, and peered out into the night. The full moon illuminated the clearing beside the cabin with an eerie silver light. Darian was digging. I could see the muscles in his back straining beneath his jacket as he worked the shovel into the rocky Montana soil. Lucinda stood beside him, holding a large bundle wrapped in what looked like a tarp or heavy plastic. The bundle was roughly 3 feet long, cylindrical, and they handled it with obvious weight and care. "Deeper," Lucinda hissed. Even from inside, I could hear the sharp edge in her voice. "It has to be deeper. The ground is frozen," Darian panted. "This is as deep as we're getting tonight. Then make it work." I watched, frozen in horror and confusion, as they lowered the bundle into the hole. It hit the bottom with a hollow thud that made my stomach turn. They worked quickly after that, shoveling the dirt back, tamping it down, scattering pine needles and small rocks over the disturbed earth. Within 20 minutes, you could barely tell the ground had been touched. They stood there for a moment, breathing hard, vapor rising from their mouths like spirits escaping. Then Lucinda put her hand on Darian's shoulder and said something I couldn't hear. They walked back toward the cabin, and I heard the front door close softly. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, shaking. My mind raced through possibilities, each more terrible than the last. What could they have buried? Why here? Why in the middle of the night? The rest of the night, I didn't sleep. I listened to every creak of the floorboards above me, every whisper of wind against the cabin walls. As dawn broke gray and cold over the mountains, I heard them moving around upstairs, preparing to leave. I stayed hidden in my room until I heard Darian's truck start and drive away, gravel crunching under the tires. I waited another 30 minutes just to be sure. Then I put on my heavy coat, found Richard's old work gloves and a shovel from the shed, and walked out to the clearing. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Birds were beginning their morning songs. Everything looked so normal, so peaceful, but I knew what lay beneath that innocent-looking patch of ground. I started digging. The earth was hard and cold, and my 68-year-old body protested with every shovelful. My back ached. My hands, even through the gloves, began to blister. But I kept going, driven by a terrible need to know. After 40 minutes of steady digging, my shovel hit something solid. The bundle. I knelt in the hole I'd created, breathing hard, and carefully cleared away the remaining dirt. The wrapping was a heavy-duty plastic tarp, the kind contractors use, secured with duct tape. My hands trembled as I found the edge and began to tear it open. The first thing I saw was metal, stainless steel, gleaming even in the dim morning light. Then I saw what it was, and I understood. A canister, medical grade, with biohazard symbols and labels I could barely read through my tears. But it was the name on the label that made me scream. Eleanor Hargrove, my granddaughter, Darian's 12-year-old daughter from his first marriage, the child I hadn't seen in over 3 years. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silence. I stumbled backward out of the hole, my legs giving way beneath me. I landed hard on the cold ground, the shock of impact barely registering through the horror that flooded my system. My vision blurred with tears as I stared at that terrible canister. Eleanor's name stark against the metal surface. Eleanor. Sweet, brilliant Eleanor with her father's dark eyes and her mother's gentle smile. The granddaughter who used to spend every summer at this cabin, helping me pick wild berries, learning to identify bird calls, reading books by the fireplace while rain drummed on the roof. The child who called me Nana and made me believe that some part of Richard lived on in her curiosity, her kindness, her fierce love of the natural world. I hadn't seen her since Darian's bitter divorce from his first wife, Simone. The split had been ugly, full of accusations and legal battles that lasted nearly 2 years. Darian had gotten remarried to Lucinda almost indecently fast, just 4 months after the divorce was finalized. After that, communication with Eleanor had become sporadic, then non-existent. Darian claimed Simone was poisoning Eleanor against him, that she refused to let Eleanor visit. I'd called, written letters, sent gifts for birthdays and holidays. Nothing. 6 months ago, I'd finally demanded answers. I drove to Seattle, showed up at Darian's glass and steel office building downtown, and refused to leave until he spoke to me. He'd been distant, uncomfortable, making excuses about Eleanor being busy with school activities, about her needing space, about teenage rebellion. He'd promised to arrange a visit soon. Soon never came. And now, here was her name on a canister buried in secret at 3 a.m. I don't know how long I sat there in the dirt. The sun rose higher, warming the air slightly, but I felt nothing but cold. Finally, my training as a former emergency room nurse kicked in. I needed to think clearly. I needed to understand what I was looking at. I forced myself to examine the canister more carefully. It was the type used for cremated remains. Medical facilities used them when they needed to transport or store human ashes securely. The label included not just Eleanor's name, but dates. Her birth date, which I knew by heart. And another date, a date 3 years ago, September 15th. September 15th, 3 years ago. That was right around the time communication with Eleanor had stopped. My mind reeled. Had Eleanor died? Had my granddaughter been dead for 3 years and no one had told me? Why would Darian hide this? Why bury her ashes in secret instead of giving her a proper resting place, a memorial, a chance for family to grieve? Unless there was something about her death they needed to hide. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. No signal. The cabin was too remote, too deep in the mountains. I'd have to drive to town, to the small community of Thornwood 15 miles away where there was cell service and internet. But first, I needed to secure the evidence. I couldn't let them know I'd discovered this. I needed time to investigate, to understand what had happened before I confronted them. Carefully, reverently, I lifted the canister from the hole. It was heavier than I expected, the weight of a young life reduced to ash and bone fragments. I carried it inside the cabin and placed it in the secret compartment Richard had built into the floor of the master bedroom closet, a space he'd created for storing valuable documents and family heirlooms. I covered it with an old quilt, then replaced the floorboards. Then I went back outside and filled in the hole. I tried to match their work, scattering pine needles, placing rocks in similar patterns. When I finished, I stood back and studied it. Would they notice? Would they realize someone had disturbed their burial site? I didn't have a choice. I needed answers more than I needed their ignorance. I cleaned up, locked the cabin, and drove toward Thornwood. The mountain road was treacherous, full of hairpin turns and steep drop-offs, but I'd driven it 1,000 times. Today, though, My hands shook on the wheel. My mind kept returning to Eleanor, to her laugh, her questions about everything, the way she'd hold my hand when we walked through the forest. Had she suffered? Had she been sick? Why hadn't Simone contacted me? Thornwood appeared like an answer to a prayer. It was barely a town, just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. A general store, a diner, a gas station, a tiny post office. I parked at the diner and pulled out my phone. As soon as I had signal, messages began flooding in, but none from Darian or Lucinda yet. They probably assumed they had more time before anyone might visit the cabin. I sat in my car and searched for Eleanor's name combined with obituaries. Nothing. I searched for death records. Nothing. I tried social media, something I rarely used, but Eleanor had been active on before the divorce. Her accounts were still there, but they hadn't been updated in 3 years. The last post was a photo of her at a debate competition, smiling proudly with a trophy. The date matched almost exactly with the date on the canister. My chest tightened. I searched for Simone next. Simone Keating. She'd gone back to her maiden name after the divorce. It took me several tries, but finally I found something. A small news article from a Seattle newspaper, dated 3 years and 2 months ago. Local woman dies in house fire. Simone Keating, 39, perished in a house fire at her Capitol Hill residence on July 28th. The fire, which started late in the evening, was ruled accidental by investigators, caused by faulty electrical wiring. Miss Keating was a respected child psychologist in the Seattle area. She is survived by her daughter, Eleanor, age 12, who was staying with her father at the time of the incident. Memorial services are pending. The phone slipped from my hands. Simone was dead. Eleanor's mother was dead. And 2 months later, according to that canister, Eleanor was dead too. But where was Eleanor's obituary? Where was the news coverage of a 12-year-old girl dying so soon after losing her mother? Where were the memorial services, the flowers, the community outpouring that always follows when a child dies? There was nothing. It was as if Eleanor had simply disappeared from the world. I sat in that car in the Thornwood Diner parking lot, watching the mountains turn gold in the afternoon sun, and I knew with terrible certainty that something was very wrong. Whatever had happened to my granddaughter, it wasn't natural. It wasn't right, and my son was at the center of it. Chapter 3. Pieces of Truth. I spent the night in a small motel on the outskirts of Thornwood. The room smelled of pine cleaner and old cigarette smoke, despite the no-smoking signs posted everywhere. I couldn't go home. I couldn't face my empty house in Portland with its photos of happier times, of Eleanor as a baby, as a toddler, as a growing child full of life and promise. Instead, I lay awake on a lumpy mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and tried to piece together what I knew. Simone died in a fire 3 years ago. The article said Eleanor was staying with Darian at the time. 2 months later, according to that canister, Eleanor was dead too, but there was no public record of her death, no obituary, no memorial service, nothing. Darian and Lucinda had buried her ashes secretly at 3 a.m. at a remote cabin. Why? The question tormented me through the long hours of the night. Every possible answer I constructed was worse than the last. Had Eleanor died in Darian's care? Had there been negligence? An accident he tried to cover up? Or something worse? I thought about my son. I'd raised him alone after his father died when Darian was 15. I'd worked double shifts at the hospital, sacrificed my own comfort and dreams to give him opportunities, to send him to good schools, to help him become the successful man he was today. I thought I knew him. I thought beneath the driven, ambitious exterior was still the boy who cried when we had to put our old dog down, who volunteered at soup kitchens during holidays, who'd been so excited to become a father. But people change. Life hardens us, and sometimes we become strangers even to those who love us most. As dawn broke gray and uncertain over the mountains, I made a decision. I needed help. This was beyond what I could investigate alone, but I also couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Not without more information. If I was wrong, if there was some explanation I couldn't see, I'd destroy my relationship with my son forever. But I needed someone with resources, with experience in uncovering secrets. I thought of Marcus Vega, a private investigator I'd met years ago when I was still working at the hospital. He'd been investigating a medical malpractice case, and we'd struck up a friendship based on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for terrible hospital coffee. He'd retired from police work after 25 years and started his own investigation firm. I'd kept his card all these years, updating his contact information whenever he moved offices. At 7 a.m, I called him. "Delphine Hargrove," he said, his voice warm with surprised recognition. "It's been at least 3 years. How are you? I need your help, Marcus. It's about my granddaughter." The warmth in his voice shifted to professional concern. "Tell me everything." I did. I told him about the burial I'd witnessed, about the canister with Eleanor's name, about Simone's death and Eleanor's disappearance from all records. I told him about the date on the canister and the timeline that didn't make sense. He listened without interrupting, and I could hear him taking notes. "This is serious, Delphine," he said when I finished. "You understand what you're potentially uncovering here?" "I know." My voice cracked. "But I have to know the truth. She was my granddaughter, Marcus. She deserves the truth. I'll start immediately. I have contacts at the medical examiner's office, at the Department of Health, places that keep records even when families try to bury them. Give me 3 days. And Delphine, be careful. If your suspicions are even partially correct, you're dealing with people who've already proven they're willing to hide terrible things." "Thank you, Marcus." "Don't thank me yet. Sometimes the truth is worse than the mystery." After hanging up, I realized I needed to maintain some semblance of normal life. I couldn't let Darian and Lucinda know I suspected anything. I drove back to Portland that afternoon, my mind racing the entire way. My house felt different when I walked through the door. The photos on the mantel seemed to mock me with their preserved happiness. Darian as a young boy, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. Darian in his college graduation gown. Darian and Simone on their wedding day. So young and full of hope. Eleanor as a baby in my arms, her tiny hand wrapped around my finger. I forced myself through the routines of daily life. I went to my book club meeting on Tuesday, though I couldn't focus on the discussion of the novel we'd read. I had lunch with my friend Patricia, who noticed I was distracted and asked if I was feeling well. I blamed it on not sleeping well, on the changing weather affecting my joints, on anything but the truth eating away at my insides. On Thursday evening, 3 days after my call, Marcus contacted me. He asked me to meet him at a coffee shop in downtown Portland, a place far from my neighborhood where we were unlikely to be seen by anyone I knew. I arrived early, taking a table in the back corner. Marcus appeared 15 minutes later, looking older than I remembered. His hair had gone completely gray, and deep lines bracketed his mouth. He carried a manila folder that he placed on the table between us, his expression grave. "I found some things," he said without preamble. "None of it is good, Delphine. Are you sure you want to know?" I thought of Eleanor's laugh, of her curiosity about the world, of all the years I'd missed with her because I'd been too polite, too accommodating, too willing to accept my son's excuses. "Tell me everything." Marcus opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents, printouts of records, and several photographs. He began laying them out methodically. Eleanor Hargrove was admitted to Children's Hospital Seattle on September 14th, 3 years ago. She was brought in by her father, Darian Hargrove, and his wife, Lucinda Hargrove. According to the admission report, Eleanor had been experiencing severe headaches and dizzy spells for several days. She'd also complained of nausea and confusion. He pulled out a medical report. The treating physician ordered a full workup: blood tests, CT scan, neurological evaluation. What they found was arsenic poisoning, significant levels in her system, consistent with repeated exposure over weeks or possibly months. The coffee shop blurred around me. I gripped the edge of the table to keep myself upright. The hospital called the police immediately, as required by law in cases of suspected child abuse. But before the police could properly interview Eleanor or begin an investigation, she suffered catastrophic organ failure. Her liver and kidneys shut down. She died on September 15th at 4:23 in the morning. She was 12 years old. Or Chapter 4, The Unraveling Thread. The words Marcus spoke seemed to come from very far away, as if I were hearing them through deep water. Arsenic poisoning, organ failure. My sweet Eleanor had suffered horribly, and I hadn't been there. I hadn't even known. "There's more," Marcus said gently, waiting for me to meet his eyes before continuing. The death triggered an automatic investigation by Child Protective Services and the police. But here's where things get murky. The case file is sealed. I couldn't access the full investigation records, but I have contacts, and they were able to tell me some things off the record. He pulled out another document. Darian and Lucinda claimed Eleanor must have been exposed to something at her mother's house before Simone's death. They suggested Simone might have kept rat poison or other toxic substances improperly stored. They provided a timeline showing Eleanor had spent the weekend at Simone's house right before her symptoms started. But Simone had been dead for 2 months by then, I said, my voice hollow. Exactly. And that's what the investigators noted. However, Darian's lawyers, and he had very expensive lawyers, argued that Eleanor could have brought contaminated items with her from her mother's house, clothing or toys that had been exposed. They created enough reasonable doubt about the source of the poisoning that the investigation stalled. Marcus pulled out more papers. Then things got even stranger. The hospital wanted to perform an autopsy, standard procedure in cases of suspected poisoning. But Darian, as the surviving parent and legal guardian, refused permission. He cited religious beliefs, which was odd, because I found no record of him being particularly religious. His lawyers fought the court order for an autopsy, and eventually, they reached a compromise. A limited external examination and some tissue samples, but no full autopsy. How is that even possible? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Money, power, lawyers who knew how to work the system. The death certificate lists the cause of death as acute organ failure secondary to toxic exposure, origin undetermined. It's vague enough to not directly implicate anyone, but specific enough to satisfy basic requirements. And then Eleanor was cremated within 48 hours. Very fast, even by modern standards. I thought about that canister, buried in secret. Did they find anything? The tissue samples? Yes. The preliminary toxicology confirmed arsenic, but without a full autopsy, they couldn't determine the exact source or method of exposure with certainty. The case remained open for about 6 months, then was quietly closed as unsolved. Officially, it's listed as a tragic accidental poisoning with undetermined circumstances. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping. But here's what my contact told me off the record, and this is someone who's been in homicide investigations for 30 years. He said the levels of arsenic in Eleanor's system, combined with the pattern of symptoms she described before admission, were consistent with repeated, deliberate poisoning over an extended period. Weeks, maybe months. This wasn't accidental exposure. Someone was giving her arsenic regularly. The coffee shop sounds, the hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of other customers, the clink of cups. It all faded away. I saw only Eleanor's face, heard only her voice from years ago asking me why people hurt each other, why the world couldn't be kind. Eleanor was living with Darian when she died, I said slowly, working through the implications. After Simone's death, custody went entirely to him. That's correct. And there's one more thing. Marcus pulled out a final document, this one a printed email chain. I managed to get these from a source at Darian's former workplace. He'd taken a leave of absence from his law firm, starting about 4 months before Eleanor died, citing family stress from his ex-wife's death. But according to his colleagues, he seemed almost relieved when it happened. One partner remembered him saying something about finally being free to live his life, just weeks after Simone's funeral. I felt sick. He wanted Eleanor gone, so he could be with Lucinda without complications, without the reminder of his first marriage, without the expense and inconvenience of raising a troubled child who'd lost her mother. That's speculation, Marcus warned, but the pattern is suggestive. Simone dies in a fire that's ruled accidental but happens conveniently when Eleanor is elsewhere. 2 months later, Eleanor starts showing symptoms of poisoning while living exclusively with Darian and Lucinda. Eleanor dies before a proper investigation can be conducted. Darian fights to prevent an autopsy. The body is cremated immediately. And now, 3 years later, you discover they've buried her ashes in secret at a remote location rather than giving her a proper memorial. They killed her, I whispered. Or at the very least, Lucinda did. And Darian covered it up. I think so, yes. But proving it after 3 years, with no body to exhume, with a sealed case file and expensive lawyers protecting them, that's going to be nearly impossible. The legal system failed Eleanor once. Without new evidence, without something concrete, I don't know if justice is achievable here. I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of it all. My son, my own flesh and blood, the boy I'd raised with such care, Such sacrifice. He'd either murdered his own daughter or stood by while his wife did it, and then he'd hidden it, covered it up, gone on living his successful life as if Eleanor had never existed. What can I do? I finally asked. Marcus closed the folder. That's up to you, Delphine. You can go to the police with what we've found, but understand that it might not lead anywhere. The case was investigated and closed. Without new physical evidence, they're unlikely to reopen it. You can confront Darian directly, but that could be dangerous. People who've killed once may do it again if they feel threatened. Or you can accept that sometimes the bad guys win, and try to find peace with that. I thought about peace, about justice, about my granddaughter's short, painful life and her unmarked end. I can't let it go, I said. I won't. Marcus nodded as if he'd expected this answer. Then we need more evidence. We need something that directly connects either Darian or Lucinda to the arsenic. Purchase records, witness statements, something that proves opportunity and intent. It won't be easy, and it might not even be possible after all this time. I have something they don't know about, I said slowly. The ashes. They think they're still buried at the cabin. If there's any remaining tissue or bone fragments in that canister, can they be tested? Marcus's eyes lit up. Possibly, yes. Modern forensic techniques can detect arsenic in bone and teeth long after death. If there are significant fragments in the cremains, we might be able to get definitive proof of poisoning levels. But cremation destroys most soft tissue and can degrade some evidence. It's not a guarantee, but it's a chance. It's a chance, he agreed. But Delphine, if we do this, we have to do it right. We need to maintain chain of custody, work with forensic specialists, do everything by the book. Otherwise, any evidence we find could be challenged or thrown out. I stood up, feeling older than my 68 years, but also feeling something else. A determination that had been missing from my life since Richard died. A purpose. Then let's do it right. Let's get justice for Eleanor. Chapter 5. The Weight of Evidence. The next 2 weeks were a blur of careful planning and agonizing waiting. Marcus arranged for a forensic anthropologist he'd worked with before, a woman named Dr. Simone Chen, who specialized in analyzing cremated remains. The irony of her first name wasn't lost on me, and I took it as a sign that Eleanor was guiding us somehow, even from beyond. We needed to be careful about how we retrieved the canister. If Darian and Lucinda suspected I'd discovered it, they might return to the cabin and move it, destroying our only physical evidence. Marcus suggested we wait until we knew they were occupied elsewhere, then retrieve it under the guise of me visiting the cabin normally. I spent those weeks maintaining my routine, calling Darian weekly as I always had, keeping my voice light and normal, even though every word tasted like ash in my mouth. He seemed pleased that I was reaching out more, probably interpreting it as me finally accepting Lucinda, finally moving past my silly concerns about Eleanor. You know, Mom, I'm glad you're doing better, he said during one of these calls. His voice had the smooth, practiced quality of someone who was very good at lying. I know losing Dad was hard, and I know you had hopes about staying close to Eleanor, but sometimes life doesn't work out the way we plan. You have to focus on the family you have, not the family you've lost. I wanted to scream at him that Eleanor hadn't just been lost, that he'd stolen her from me, from the world, but I kept my voice steady. You're right, dear. I'm trying to look forward, not back. Actually, I was thinking of going up to the cabin next weekend. Maybe you and Lucinda would like to join me. We could finally have that quality time together. There was a pause. Next weekend isn't good for us. Big real estate conference in Vancouver. Lucinda's keynoting. Maybe the weekend after. Of course, I said, my heart racing. You two enjoy yourselves. I'll just have a quiet weekend in the mountains. After I hung up, I called Marcus. They'll be in Vancouver next weekend. The cabin will be empty. Perfect, he said. I'll arrange for Dr. Chen to meet us there Sunday morning. We'll document everything, retrieve the canister and get it to her lab. Then we wait for the results. That weekend felt like the longest of my life. I drove to the cabin on Friday evening, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. The autumn weather had turned cold, and the first snow of the season was forecasted for the higher elevations. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it, peaceful and innocent in the twilight. I spent Friday night unable to sleep, listening to the wind through the pines, remembering all the times Eleanor and I had stayed here together. I remembered teaching her to fish in the lake, the patience required, the joy on her face when she caught her first trout. I remembered her collecting leaves and pressing them in an old book, labeling each one with its species name in her careful handwriting. I remembered her questions about everything: why the sky was blue, why people fell in love, why some families stayed together and others fell apart. I hadn't been able to protect her from the falling apart. I hadn't even known she needed protection. Saturday, I forced myself to eat, to maintain my strength. I walked around the property, noting how the burial site looked undisturbed. They hadn't come back. They probably assumed their secret was safe, buried deep in the Montana wilderness where no one would think to look. Sunday morning, Marcus arrived at 9, followed shortly by Dr. Chen. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a professional manner that immediately put me at ease. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "I'm very sorry for your loss. Marcus has explained the situation to me. I want you to know that I'll treat your granddaughter's remains with the utmost respect and care. Whatever we find, we'll find the truth." We went inside. I led them to the master bedroom closet and opened the secret compartment. The canister was exactly where I'd left it, wrapped in the old quilt. Dr. Chen put on gloves before lifting it out carefully. "Medical-grade storage canister," she noted, examining it closely. "Properly sealed. The contents should be well preserved. Mrs. Hargrove, I need to document everything. May I take photographs?" "Whatever you need," I said. She spent the next hour meticulously photographing the canister from every angle, documenting the label with Eleanor's name and dates, taking samples of the tape used to seal it, noting every detail in a leather-bound notebook. Marcus filmed everything on a professional video camera, creating an unbroken chain of evidence. Finally, Dr. Chen carefully placed the canister in a secure case she'd brought with her. "I'll transport this directly to my lab in Seattle. The analysis will take approximately 2 weeks. I'll be looking for several things. First, the presence and concentration of arsenic in any bone fragments. Second, the pattern of distribution, which can tell us whether exposure was acute or chronic. Third, any other anomalies that might indicate cause of death or circumstances surrounding it. Will there be enough evidence left?" I asked. "After cremation. Cremation doesn't destroy everything," she explained. "Bone fragments remain, especially denser bones like teeth and parts of the skull. Arsenic binds to bone matrix and can persist long after soft tissue is gone. If Eleanor was poisoned repeatedly over weeks or months, as the hospital records suggest, there should be detectable levels. The question is whether those levels will be conclusive enough to prove deliberate poisoning rather than accidental exposure." After they left, I sat in the cabin for a long time, holding a photo of Eleanor I'd brought with me. It was one of my favorites, taken here at the cabin when she was 10. She was holding a butterfly that had landed on her finger, her face lit up with wonder and delight. She'd been so gentle with it, so careful, letting it stay as long as it wanted before it flew away. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," I whispered to the photo. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you, but I promise you, sweetheart, I'm going to make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it costs me." The 2 weeks that followed were agony. I went through the motions of my life, but I was hollow inside, just waiting for Dr. Chen's call. I dreamed of Eleanor every night, dreams where she was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of wind and water. Finally, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was pretending to read in my living room, my phone rang. Dr. Chen's name appeared on the screen. "Mrs. Hargrove, I have the results. Can you come to my office? I think this is a conversation we should have in person. I can be there tomorrow," I said, my heart pounding. "Tomorrow at 10. And Mrs. Hargrove, bring Marcus with you. You're going to want support for this." That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I drove to Seattle, meeting Marcus outside Dr. Chen's office building. It was a nondescript professional complex, the kind of place where important work happens away from public view. Dr. Chen's office was on the 3rd floor, a space that managed to be both clinical and comfortable. She gestured us to chairs across from her desk, where she had several files and reports spread out. "I'll give you the summary first, then we can go through the details," she said, her expression serious. "The cremated remains contain bone fragments sufficient for thorough analysis. I was able to extract and test samples from 3 different skeletal areas. All 3 samples showed extremely elevated levels of arsenic, far beyond what could be explained by environmental exposure or accidental contamination. She pulled out a chart showing different colored bars. These are the comparative levels. This red line represents the maximum level you'd expect from environmental exposure in an area with naturally occurring arsenic. These blue bars represent Eleanor's bone fragment samples. As you can see, they're approximately 15 times higher than natural levels. What does that mean exactly? I asked, though I already knew. It means Eleanor was exposed to significant amounts of arsenic over an extended period. Based on the distribution pattern in different bone types and the concentration levels, I'd estimate repeated exposure over at least 8 to 12 weeks prior to her death. This is not accidental. This is not environmental. Someone was deliberately poisoning this child. Chapter 6. The confrontation I never wanted. The drive back from Seattle to Portland felt different than any drive I'd ever taken. I had the evidence now. Scientific proof that Eleanor had been murdered. Dr. Chen had prepared a formal report that Marcus assured me would be admissible in court. We had enough to reopen the investigation. But as I sat in Marcus's office the next day, reviewing our next steps, I felt the weight of what I was about to destroy settling on my shoulders like a physical burden. Once we take this to the police, there's no going back, Marcus said, watching me carefully. Your son will be arrested. Lucinda will be arrested. There will be a trial, media coverage, everything in your family's life laid bare for public consumption. Are you ready for that? I thought about Darian as a little boy, crying in my arms after his father died. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made raising him alone. I thought about the pride I'd felt watching him succeed, become something, make a life for himself. Then I thought about Eleanor, 12 years old and suffering, her body slowly breaking down from the poison someone was feeding her. I thought about her dying alone in a hospital while the people who should have protected her conspired to hide their crime. I'm ready, I said. Eleanor deserves justice, even if it destroys me to give it to her. But Marcus surprised me with his next suggestion. Before we go to the police, I think you should confront Darian. Get his side of the story on record. Sometimes, when faced with undeniable evidence, people confess. They want to explain, to justify, to share the burden of what they've done. If we can get a confession, even a partial one, it makes the prosecution's case much stronger. You want me to wear a wire. Audio recording would be legally admissible if you consent to the recording and it takes place in a location where there's no expectation of privacy, like your home. You'd be protecting yourself too. If Darian reacts violently when confronted, we'd have evidence. The thought of secretly recording my son made me feel ill, but I understood the necessity. When? Soon. Before they have any chance to realize something's wrong. Can you arrange a dinner at your house? Make it seem natural, like you just want family time. I called Darian that afternoon, keeping my voice light and cheerful. Honey, I was thinking, it's been so long since we had a proper family dinner. Why don't you and Lucinda come over Saturday night? I'll make your favorite, pot roast with those roasted vegetables you love. There was a pause. That sounds great, Mom. But actually, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. Can I come by myself? Just the two of us? I think it would be good to have some one-on-one time. My blood ran cold. Did he suspect something? Had he somehow found out about the investigation? Of course, dear. Saturday at 6. Perfect. See you then, Mom. When I told Marcus about the change in plans, he frowned. I don't like it. Why would he suddenly want to come alone? It could be innocent, or it could be that he's worried about something. We need to be extra careful. Saturday arrived cold and gray, with the promise of rain in the heavy clouds. Marcus came over that morning to set up the recording equipment. It was surprisingly simple, just a small device hidden in a decorative bowl on my dining room shelf, positioned to capture audio from anywhere in the room. I'll be parked down the street, Marcus told me. You'll have a panic button on your phone. If anything goes wrong, press it and I'll be inside in seconds. Do not hesitate to use it, Delphine. I don't know what Darian's capable of, and we're potentially about to find out. I spent the afternoon cooking, moving through the familiar routines like a woman in a dream. The pot roast, the roasted carrots and potatoes, the apple pie for dessert that had been Richard's favorite. I set the table with our good china, the pieces Eleanor used to be so careful with, treating each plate like it was precious. At exactly 6 o'clock, I heard Darian's car in the driveway. I watched through the window as he got out, adjusting his expensive suit jacket, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized from his childhood when he was nervous about something. I opened the door before he could knock. He looked older than when I'd last seen him in person. Deeper lines around his eyes, a hardness to his mouth that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had, and I just refused to see it. "Mom," he said, pulling me into a brief hug that felt performative. "Something smells amazing. Come in, come in. Everything's ready." We went through the motions of dinner, small talk about his work, about the weather, about nothing important. He ate mechanically, clearly preoccupied. Finally, as I was serving the pie, he set down his fork and looked at me directly. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. "Of course, dear. Have you been to the cabin recently? Outside of the times I knew you were going?" I met his eyes, seeing the calculation there, the lawyer's mind working to assess my response. "I went up there about 3 weeks ago. Didn't mention it because I didn't think it was important." "Why?" He studied me for a long moment. "The ground near the woodshed looks disturbed, like someone dug there and tried to cover it up. I thought maybe it was animals, but the pattern is wrong for that." Here it was, the moment of truth. I could continue pretending ignorance, or I could confront him with what I knew. I thought of Marcus parked down the street, of the recording device capturing everything, of Eleanor's ashes that proved the truth. I stood up, went to my desk in the corner, and pulled out the folder Marcus had given me. I brought it back to the table and placed it in front of Darian. "I know about Eleanor," I said quietly. "I know what you did." The color drained from his face. "What are you talking about?" "I saw you and Lucinda bury something that night. I waited until you left, and I dug it up. I found the canister with Eleanor's ashes. I had them tested, Darian. I know she was poisoned. I know she died in your care. I know you covered it up." For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then, slowly, his expression changed. The mask of shock fell away, replaced by something colder, something that made me realize I was looking at a stranger wearing my son's face. "You had no right," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You had no right to interfere in my life, to dig up things that were none of your business. She was my granddaughter. She was your daughter, and someone killed her. She was a problem." The words exploded out of him, and suddenly he was standing, pacing, his careful control cracking. "Do you have any idea what it was like? Simone died, and suddenly I'm stuck with this damaged, traumatized kid who blamed me for everything. Who made Lucinda's life hell? Who threatened to tell everyone that Lucinda and I had been together before the divorce, that we'd been planning to be together. Eleanor was going to destroy everything I'd built. So you killed her?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Your own daughter." "I didn't kill her." He stopped pacing, turned to face me. "I didn't give her the arsenic. That was Lucinda. She said she just wanted to make Eleanor sick enough that we could put her in a care facility, claim she needed specialized treatment. It was supposed to be temporary, just enough to get her out of our house while we got on with our lives. But Eleanor's system was weaker than we thought. The dosage wasn't right. And then it was too late." The casual way he spoke about it, as if he were describing a business deal gone wrong, made my stomach turn. "You let your wife poison your daughter," I said. "You watched her die, and then you covered it up. What was I supposed to do?" He spread his hands, that lawyer's gesture asking for understanding. "If the truth came out, my career would have been over. Lucinda would have gone to prison. For what? Eleanor was already gone. Ruining our lives wouldn't bring her back. So you had her cremated immediately. You fought the autopsy. You buried her ashes in secret so no one would ever know. I did what I had to do to protect my family. My real family. Lucinda and I, we have a life together. We have plans. A kid from a failed marriage wasn't going to destroy that. I stared at this man who had my son's face, who had my son's voice, but who was somehow a complete stranger to me. "Who are you?" I whispered. "When did you become this person?" "I became the person I needed to be to survive," he said. "You taught me that, Mom. You taught me that when things are hard, you do what you have to do to keep going. That's what I did. I taught you to fight for what's right, not to murder children." "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice turning cold again. "Are you going to go to the police with your evidence? Do you really think they'll believe you?" The case was investigated and closed. I have lawyers who will tear apart anything you present. And even if, by some miracle, it goes to trial, do you really want to be responsible for sending your only son to prison? You're responsible for that, Darian. Not me. He laughed, a bitter sound. Fine. Go ahead. Destroy what's left of our family, but know this, Mom. I'll fight it every step of the way. I'll drag you through years of legal battles. I'll make sure everyone knows you're a bitter old woman who can't let go of the past. And even if I lose, even if I go to prison, you'll lose too. You'll lose your son. You'll lose any chance of grandchildren in the future. You'll die alone with nothing but your precious principles to keep you warm. I already lost my son, I said, tears finally streaming down my face. The boy I raised died a long time ago. I just didn't realize it until now. Chapter 7. The Choice That Changed Everything. After Darian left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows, I sat at my dining table surrounded by the remains of our last dinner together and wept. Not gentle, dignified tears, but harsh, body-racking sobs that tore from somewhere deep in my chest. I wept for Eleanor, for the grandmother I'd failed to be. I wept for my son, the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. I wept for Richard, grateful he hadn't lived to see what our son had turned into. Marcus came in after a few minutes, having heard everything through the recording equipment. He didn't say anything, just pulled up a chair and sat beside me, his presence a quiet comfort in the devastation. When I could finally speak again, my voice was hoarse. He admitted it. He told me everything. I know. We got it all on recording. His confession, even though he tried to shift primary blame to Lucinda, is enough to reopen the case. Combined with Dr. Chen's forensic evidence, we have a strong case for prosecution. He said he'd fight, that he'd destroy me in the process. He will fight, Marcus agreed. Men like Darian, men who've convinced themselves they did nothing wrong. They fight until the very end. It will be ugly, Delphine. There will be media attention, character assassination, everything he threatened and worse. Are you still willing to go through with this? I thought about Eleanor again. I thought about all the other children who might suffer if people like Darian and Lucinda were allowed to continue believing they could get away with anything. I thought about justice, that heavy, complicated word that meant something different to everyone, but had to mean something. Yes, I said. I'm willing. What's our next step? We take everything to the police tomorrow. The recording, Dr. Chen's forensic report, all the evidence we've gathered. We request that they reopen the investigation into Eleanor's death. With what we have, they won't have a choice. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through my house, looking at all the photographs, all the memories preserved in frames. I stopped at one picture I'd always loved. It was taken at Eleanor's 9th birthday party, before the divorce, before everything fell apart. Eleanor was laughing, caught mid-motion as she reached for something outside the frame. Darian stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, smiling at something Simone had said. They'd looked happy then. They'd looked like a family. What had happened? When had the man in that photo, who seemed to genuinely love his daughter, become someone capable of watching her die without remorse? I thought about what Darian had said, that I'd taught him to do whatever it took to survive. Had I? In my years of working double shifts, of sacrificing my own needs, of pushing him to excel, had I somehow given him the message that success mattered more than humanity? That winning was more important than being good. The guilt of that thought nearly crushed me. But beneath the guilt was something else. Anger. Because even if I'd made mistakes, even if I'd been too focused on survival and success, I'd never taught him it was acceptable to harm the innocent. I'd never taught him that people were disposable. Those choices were his own. The next morning, Marcus and I walked into Portland Police Department's downtown precinct. We'd called ahead and arranged a meeting with a detective in the cold case unit, a woman named Detective Sarah Morales, who had a reputation for thoroughness and a personal commitment to justice for child victims. She was younger than I expected, perhaps in her late 30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She invited us into a small conference room and listened without interrupting as Marcus presented our evidence. The recording of Darian's confession, Dr. Chen's forensic report, the timeline we'd constructed, the original hospital records from Eleanor's admission and death. When Marcus finished, Detective Morales sat back in her chair, her expression grave. This is substantial. I remember this case from 3 years ago. It bothered a lot of people at the time, the way it was closed so quickly. But there was pressure from above, lawyers making noise, and without solid evidence of who administered the poison, we couldn't proceed. Now you have that evidence, Marcus said. You have a confession from Darian Hargrove admitting that his wife poisoned Eleanor with his knowledge. You have forensic proof that Eleanor was deliberately poisoned over an extended period. Detective Morales nodded slowly. I need to take this to my captain, and will need to involve the district attorney's office. But based on what you've shown me, I believe we have grounds to arrest both Darian and Lucinda Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove, she turned to me. I need you to understand what's about to happen. Once we make arrests, this becomes a public investigation. Your son's name, your granddaughter's name, your family will be in the news. The defense will try to discredit you, to suggest you're a vengeful grandmother with an agenda. They'll bring up any past conflicts, any reason you might have to lie. It will be brutal. I understand, I said. Oh, but Eleanor deserves better than the silence that's protected her killers for 3 years. She deserves people to know what happened to her, even if it destroys me in the process. All right then. Detective Morales stood up, gathering the files. I'll start the process. This will move quickly once it starts. Probably arrests by end of week. Are you in a safe location? I'm concerned that once Darian realizes what's happening, he might try to intimidate you or worse. She'll stay with me, Marcus said firmly. My building has good security, and I can keep an eye on things. Over the next 3 days, I lived in a strange state of suspended animation, waiting for the moment when everything would become real and irrevocable. Marcus had a spare bedroom in his apartment, and I stayed there, too afraid to return home alone, not knowing what Darian might do when he realized I'd followed through on my threat. On Thursday afternoon, Detective Morales called. We have them. Darian and Lucinda Hargrove were arrested this morning on charges of first-degree murder in the death of Eleanor Hargrove. The story's breaking now. I wanted you to hear it from me first. I turned on the television. There it was, on the local news. Footage of Darian being led out of his office building in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Lucinda being escorted from their expensive home in the hills. The reporter's voiceover explaining the charges, the allegations, the shocking confession. The victim, 12-year-old Eleanor Hargrove, died 3 years ago in what was then ruled an accidental poisoning, the reporter said. But new evidence has come to light suggesting her death was actually a deliberate murder. According to sources close to the investigation, Eleanor's grandmother, Delphine Hargrove, never gave up searching for the truth about what happened to her granddaughter. My phone started ringing. News outlets, reporters, people I hadn't spoken to in years calling to ask if it was true, if I really believed my own son was a murderer. I turned off my phone and sat in Marcus's living room, staring at the screen as my family's tragedy played out for public consumption. How do you feel? Marcus asked quietly, sitting beside me. Empty, I said honestly. I thought I'd feel relief or vindication or something. But I just feel empty. My son is going to prison. My granddaughter is still dead. Nothing I've done changes that. You gave Eleanor a voice, Marcus said. You made sure her death mattered, that it couldn't just be swept away and forgotten. That's not nothing, Delphine. Chapter 8. The Trial of Truth. The trial began 6 months later, in the spring. Those months between the arrests and the trial were some of the hardest of my life. I'd returned to my house, but it felt different now, haunted by ghosts of a family that no longer existed. Neighbors who'd known me for decades looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Some supported my decision to testify against my son. Others thought I was a monster for destroying my own family. My book club quietly asked me not to return. Patricia stopped calling. I'd become toxic, the woman who'd sent her own son to prison, and people didn't know how to be around that kind of pain. The media attention was relentless. Reporters camped outside my house. My face appeared on television, in newspapers, on internet articles, always with unflattering photos and leading questions. Grandmother's quest for justice or vindictive crusade? One headline asked, Mother's betrayal, the woman who destroyed her son. Another proclaimed, the defense attorneys did exactly what Detective Morales had warned they would do. They painted me as a bitter, lonely widow who'd never accepted Darian's second marriage, who'd manufactured evidence to destroy his happiness. They suggested I'd tampered with the ashes, planted the arsenic evidence, recorded Darian's confession under duress. But they couldn't explain away the hospital records. They couldn't explain away Dr. Chen's careful forensic analysis conducted under strict chain of custody. They couldn't explain away Darian's own words on the recording, his admission that Lucinda had poisoned Eleanor with his knowledge. The prosecution's case was strong, built on the foundation Marcus and I had carefully constructed. They brought in expert witnesses who testified about arsenic poisoning, about the impossibility of Eleanor's arsenic levels occurring naturally. They brought in medical professionals who'd treated Eleanor, who described her suffering in her final days. Dr. Chen testified, presenting her findings with calm authority. She showed the jury comparative charts of arsenic levels, explained how the distribution pattern in Eleanor's bone fragments proved repeated exposure, demonstrated that this couldn't have been accidental. And then it was my turn to testify. I dreaded this moment, sitting in the witness box, looking out at the courtroom filled with strangers and news cameras, knowing that every word I spoke would be analyzed and judged. But when the prosecutor asked me to tell Eleanor's story, something shifted inside me. I talked about my granddaughter, not about the crime, not about the evidence, but about Eleanor as a person. I told them about her curiosity, her gentleness with living things, her questions about the world. I told them about the summers at the cabin, about teaching her to fish and identify birds. I told them about her dreams of becoming a marine biologist, of studying the oceans, of understanding the interconnected systems that kept the world alive. She asked me once, I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face, why people hurt each other when we're all just trying to survive. I told her that sometimes people forget that everyone else is human too, that they get so focused on their own needs and wants that they stop seeing other people as real. She said that was sad. She said we should try harder to remember. I looked directly at Darian as I spoke. He sat at the defense table, his expensive suit perfect, his expression carefully neutral. But I saw something flicker in his eyes when I talked about Eleanor, some small recognition of the child he'd helped create and then destroyed. Eleanor was real, I continued. She was a real person with real dreams and a real future, and someone took that away from her. Someone she trusted, someone who should have protected her. That's what this trial is about. Not about me or my relationship with my son. It's about Eleanor, and whether we as a society believe that children like her matter enough to demand justice when they're harmed. The defense attorneys cross-examined me aggressively. They questioned my timeline, suggested my grief had clouded my judgment, implied I'd manipulated evidence. But I'd spent months preparing for this with the prosecutors. I stayed calm, answered every question directly, and never wavered from the truth. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery, watching as witnesses testified, as evidence was presented, as the full scope of what Darian and Lucinda had done emerged piece by piece. The most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. One of Darian's former colleagues at his law firm, a younger associate who'd been mentored by him, came forward. She testified that Darian had once told her that the hardest part of being a parent was pretending you cared about your kids' problems when you really just wanted them to disappear so you could live your life. She'd thought he was joking at the time. Now, in the context of the trial, the words took on a sinister meaning. Lucinda's defense was that she'd been following Darian's instructions, that she was a victim of domestic abuse who'd feared her husband would harm her if she didn't comply with his plan. But the prosecution brought in witnesses who'd known them as a couple, who testified that Lucinda was the dominant personality in their marriage, the one who made decisions and controlled their household. Text messages recovered from Lucinda's phone, deleted but retrieved by forensic specialists, showed her researching arsenic poisoning, looking up symptoms and lethal doses, asking questions in anonymous online forums about how to make someone sick without killing them. The evidence was overwhelming, but as the trial progressed, I began to realize something that made my chest ache. Even if they were convicted, even if they went to prison for the rest of their lives, it wouldn't bring Eleanor back. It wouldn't give me back those years I should have had with her. It wouldn't erase the suffering she endured in her final weeks. Just as I was learning and was a cold comfort, the jury deliberated for 3 days. I spent those days in Marcus's apartment, unable to eat, barely sleeping, waiting for a phone call that would determine the final chapter of this nightmare. When the call came, Detective Morales' voice was carefully neutral. "The jury has reached a verdict. They're reading it in 1 hour." Marcus drove me to the courthouse. We pushed through crowds of reporters, cameras flashing, people shouting questions I didn't answer. Inside the courtroom, I took my seat in the gallery and waited. Darian and Lucinda were brought in. Darian looked thinner than he had at the start of the trial, the stress showing in the lines of his face. Lucinda looked defiant, her chin raised, refusing to show weakness. The judge asked the jury foreman to read the verdict. "In the case of the state of Oregon versus Darian Hargrove and Lucinda Hargrove, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Eleanor Hargrove, we the jury find the defendants guilty." The courtroom erupted, reporters typing frantically, people reacting with gasps and tears, the judge calling for order. But I sat perfectly still, watching Darian's face as the words sunk in. For just a moment, his mask cracked. He looked at me across the courtroom, and I saw something that might have been regret, or might have been rage, or might have been nothing but the realization that he'd finally lost. Then the moment passed. He turned away, and the guards took him and Lucinda out of the courtroom in handcuffs. "It's over," Marcus said beside me. "You did it, Delphine. You got justice for Eleanor." But as I sat in that courtroom, surrounded by strangers celebrating a verdict, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired and old and alone. Tapuri, Chapter 9, The Aftermath of Justice. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks after the verdict. The judge sentenced both Darian and Lucinda to life in prison without the possibility of parole. First-degree murder of a child, combined with the calculated nature of the crime and the attempted cover-up, warranted the maximum sentence. I didn't attend the sentencing. I'd said everything I needed to say during the trial. Instead, I watched it on television in my living room, the same room where Darian and I had shared our last dinner together. After the sentencing, the media attention gradually died down. I became yesterday's news, replaced by fresher tragedies, newer scandals. The reporters stopped calling. The neighbors stopped staring. Life, as it always does, moved on. But I couldn't move on. Not yet. I spent my days in a fog of grief that was different from the grief I'd felt after Richard died. That had been a clean grief, painful but natural, the sadness of losing someone to time and circumstance. This was complicated grief, tangled up with betrayal and guilt, and questions I'd never be able to answer. Patricia called me one afternoon in July, months after the trial ended. "Delphine," she said carefully, "we all miss you at book club. We were wondering if you might want to come back. Not to talk about what happened, just to be with friends again." I almost said no. It would have been easier to keep isolating myself, to accept that I'd become someone apart from normal society, marked by tragedy. But something in Patricia's voice, a genuine warmth I'd almost forgotten existed, made me reconsider. "I'd like that," I said. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Your family, Delphine. What you went through doesn't change that." Slowly, carefully, I began rebuilding some connection to the world. I returned to book club. I started volunteering at the local library, helping children with reading programs. I found a grief counseling group for grandparents who'd lost grandchildren, and I attended weekly, listening to other people's stories of loss, sharing my own. One of the counselors suggested I write letters to Eleanor, a way of processing my grief and maintaining a connection to her memory. At first, the idea seemed silly, writing to someone who'd never read the words, but I tried it. "Dear Eleanor," I wrote in my first letter, "I'm sorry. Those are the words I need to say first, the words that wake me up at night. I'm sorry I wasn't there to protect you. I'm sorry I didn't see the danger you were in. I'm sorry I let you down when you needed me most. But I want you to know that I fought for you, even though it was too late to save you. I made sure the truth came out. I made sure people know what happened, that your death wasn't just swept away and forgotten. I hope, wherever you are, that brings you some peace." The letters became a regular practice. Every Sunday evening, I'd sit at my desk and write to her, telling her about my week, sharing thoughts I couldn't share with anyone else, maintaining the grandmother-granddaughter connection that had been stolen from us. Marcus visited regularly, checking on me, making sure I was taking care of myself. We'd become close friends through this ordeal, bound by the terrible knowledge we shared. "Have you thought about what you'll do with the cabin?" he asked one afternoon over coffee. "I know it holds complicated memories now." I had thought about it. The cabin represented both the best times with Eleanor and the worst discovery of my life. But I'd decided something in the month since the trial. I'm going to turn it into a retreat for foster children, I said. A place where kids in difficult situations can come experience nature, learn about the mountains, just be children for a while. I'll call it Eleanor's Haven. It won't bring her back, but maybe it can help other children who need a safe space. Marcus smiled. She'd like that, using something painful to create something good. The process of converting the cabin took over a year. I worked with social services, got the necessary permits and licenses, made modifications to accommodate groups of children safely. I hired staff, developed programs, created activities that honored Eleanor's love of nature. Eleanor's Haven opened on what would have been her 16th birthday. We held a small ceremony, planting a tree in her memory beside the lake where she'd loved to fish. I invited Dr. Chen, Detective Morales, Marcus, and a few close friends. We stood together in the clearing where I'd discovered the truth, and we transformed that space from a site of horror into a place of hope. Eleanor Grace Hargrove, I said, reading from a plaque we'd mounted on the tree. Beloved daughter, granddaughter, and friend. Her curiosity brightened the world. Her gentleness touched all who knew her. Her memory inspires us to protect and cherish the children who need us most. The first group of foster children arrived the following week. Watching them explore the forest, catch their first fish, collect leaves and rocks with the same wonder Eleanor had shown, I felt something shift inside me. Not healing exactly. The wound was too deep for that, but perhaps the beginning of meaning, a way to transform tragedy into purpose. Unturi. Chapter 10. The letter I never expected. 2 years after the trial, I received a letter forwarded from the prison where Darian was serving his sentence. I almost threw it away without opening it. What could he possibly say that I wanted to hear? But curiosity, or perhaps some last vestige of the mother I'd been, made me open it. Dear Mom, I don't expect you to respond to this letter. I don't expect forgiveness or understanding. I'm writing because my therapist here says I need to try to process what I've done, and part of that process is acknowledging the harm I've caused to everyone involved. You were right. About everything. I did become someone you didn't recognize. I'm not sure when it happened exactly. Maybe it was gradual, a series of small compromises and rationalizations that added up to losing my humanity. Maybe it was always in me, some darkness I inherited or developed, and I just got better at hiding it over the years. I loved Eleanor once. I need you to know that. When she was born, I held her and felt something I'd never felt before, this overwhelming protective instinct. But love isn't enough when you're fundamentally broken. And I was broken, Mom. Not in a way that excuses what I did, but in a way that explains how I could do it. After Simone died, Eleanor looked at me with such accusation in her eyes. She knew, even though she never said it directly, that I'd been cheating on her mother. She knew I was responsible for the divorce that had torn her world apart. And every time she looked at me, I saw myself reflected in her eyes as the failure I was. Lucinda promised she could fix it. She said Eleanor just needed attitude adjustment, that we could make her compliant, easier to handle. I knew what she was doing. I watched her slipping powder into Eleanor's food, saw Eleanor getting weaker, and I let it happen because it was easier than facing what I'd become. When Eleanor died, I felt relief. That's what I can't forgive myself for. Not just that I allowed it to happen, but that when it was over, my first emotion was relief that the problem was solved. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm not asking you to visit or write back. I'm just telling you that you did the right thing. You gave Eleanor the justice I denied her. You showed her that she mattered, that her life had value, even when her own father treated her as disposable. I think about her every day. I see her face in my dreams, and she's always asking me why. Why did I stop loving her? Why wasn't she worth protecting? I don't have answers that make sense. I just have the reality of what I did, and the rest of my life to live with it. You taught me to do what was right, even when it was hard. I forgot that lesson, or I never really learned it. But you showed me in the end what real strength looks like. It takes more courage to tell the truth and face the consequences than to hide in lies. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything, for Eleanor, for failing you, for becoming the kind of man who could do what I did. I'm sorry that I turned the love you gave me into something so poisonous. Your son, Darian. I read the letter 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table as afternoon faded to evening. It was the first time Darian had truly acknowledged what he'd done. The first time he'd expressed actual remorse rather than just anger at being caught. But it didn't change anything. Eleanor was still dead. My son was still a murderer. The years we should have had were still lost. I folded the letter carefully and put it in a box with other items from the case, the evidence, the news clippings, the documentation of how my family had shattered. I didn't respond to Darian's letter. What would I say? That I forgave him? I didn't. Not fully. Maybe someday, but not yet. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where we'd finally laid Eleanor's ashes to rest after the trial concluded. She had a proper headstone now, marking the grave that should have existed 3 years earlier. I brought fresh flowers and sat beside her. "Your father wrote to me," I told her, as I did on my visits. "He said he was sorry. I don't know if it's real remorse or just him processing his situation, but he said the words at least. I thought you should know." A cool breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves on nearby trees. I imagined it was Eleanor's way of responding, though I knew that was just my need for connection, creating meaning where there was only wind. "I'm doing okay," I continued. "Some days are harder than others. But the cabin, Eleanor's haven, it's helping other kids now. 23 children came through last summer. We taught them about the forest, about the lake, about how to see the beauty in the world even when things are hard. I think you'd approve." I stayed until the sun set, then drove home through the gathering dark. My house, once so full of photos and memories, had become simpler over the years. I'd put away many of the pictures of Darian, unable to reconcile the smiling boy in those photos with the man he'd become. But Eleanor's pictures remained, marking the walls with her presence, her memory. That night, I wrote another letter to her, continuing the practice I'd maintained since the trial. "Dear Eleanor, your father wrote to me today. He said he was sorry, that he thinks about you every day, that he knows he failed you. I don't know if his remorse is real or if it matters. Sorry doesn't bring you back. Sorry doesn't erase your suffering. But I want you to know that I'm not sorry I fought for you. Even though it cost me my son, even though it made me into someone I never thought I'd be, I would do it again. You deserved someone who would fight for you, who would demand justice even when it was painful. I miss you every day. I miss your questions, your laugh, your gentle way of seeing the world. I miss the person you would have become, the marine biologist studying the oceans, the woman who would have made the world better just by being in it. Your memory keeps me going. When I want to give up, when the grief feels too heavy, I think about you and I keep trying, because you never got the chance to grow up, to follow your dreams, to become who you were meant to be. The least I can do is keep living, keep fighting, keep trying to make the world a little bit better in your honor. I love you, Eleanor. Always, Nana.